Hi there, welcome to the Culture of Life podcast. I'm Tad Wojcik, the Mission Research Specialist, and this is Father Boquet.
Well, Tad, good to be with you again.
Yes, absolutely. It's always great to talk to you. So today we're talking about an article Father wrote in October of 2020. October 19th was the publication date, called "A Christian Vision of Society and the Civilization of Love." This is kind of a sort of perennial topic, though, Father, when it comes to the difference between the way our current culture, you might put that in scare quotes, views the ideal relationships between humans and interactions between people and society, and the way the Church views the ideal. And I believe the civilization of love is a phrase that comes out of Vatican II. Is that correct?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And that would be the document Gaudium et Spes?
Correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. So I think when we talk about this, Tad, is to look at two very different visions, and that's kind of the way to kind of poise the conversation in the column. Mm-hmm. Looking at human person from two different, completely opposing views. In a sense, that one view looks at the human person as part of a cog. We're here to, you don't hurt me, I won't hurt you, you leave me alone, I leave you alone, we'll agree to live together, as long as you don't bother me, we'll get along just fine.
It's Thomas Hobbes, it's
right.
A Hobbesian view.
Exactly. Versus the anthropology that really begins with the dignity of the human person, this understanding of how do we cultivate a civilization of life and love. And it really starts when we recognize the inherent dignity of the human person, made in the image and likeness of God. So it doesn't see me out to get you, or you out to get me, or we're together because we're afraid of each other, so we build walls. No, it really does see that there is a complementary relationship, and a relationship that really sees the flourishing of each individual within that society that builds up the common good. And that's the starting point of recognizing the two different views.
Right.
And it's just good for us to talk about this, because we don't always see it so vividly. John Paul, who coined the phrases that we often use, culture of death, culture of life, and then obviously we can explain those terms as we're talking about, these two different visions. But, in most society and everyday life, people don't always see those differences. They don't come across their table. The main topics, of course, abortion, euthanasia, those kind of bring it all to bear. But in reality, it's part of daily life. These two visions are very much around us. And it's up to us to really to pierce through them and to respond to how we're all to respond. And that is, what is the good for Tad? And Tad's concerned, what's the good for me? And how do we then, in turn, care about the good of others and the flourishment of others, and assist each other to obtain that full flourishment? And that's a very different vision. That means I'm responsible for you, you're responsible for me. There is a connection that unites us, and it's a transcendent connection, and it really takes an effort to see it and to visualize it, and then to actualize that in our daily life.
Right, so that makes sense. This is the difference between the civilization of the world. You might call it by some more ancient names, the city of man, right, and the Christian civilization, which would be the city of God. Those would be the terms of St. Augustine. But it seems like what we're talking about is the basis of the civilization. The Christian civilization is love. And so can you describe, that's a buzzword, that's everyone, you go any town in the country right now and you see LOVE in the downtown square. What's the difference between the way our current society views that concept of love and the way the Church sees it, or the way Christ has given it to us? Sure.
The great command, our Lord reminds us that we are to love God with all of our being, so mind, body, soul, but also to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. But it starts, when an understanding of how we've been created and why we've been created. So a very different vision of the human person. So, for example, in my column, I talk about, when you look at the animal kingdom, the particular animal, is not concerned, about the very things that humans should be concerned about. In other words, they go in search of food, shelter, partnerships, if you will, sexual encounters. But we don't go around, in that regard as an animal would. That our understanding of human sexuality is very different. Our understanding of responsibility toward our neighbor is very different in a sense, in how we react to the daily challenges and responsibilities are very, very different than an animal in the animal kingdom that really is concerned about its own well-being, its shelter, protective of its own food, very, in a sense, not in a rational way, but very much an individual, again, protecting, whereas for myself, that, I am an individual, unique, irrepeatable, in a sense, but I'm connected to a human family. And that human family, what unites me is what Christ calls me to, and that is to a greater gift of self, a self-giving, an other orientation. So to be other-oriented means that your well-being is of equal value to my own well-being, and in a sense of how I seek that good in you and how you do that myself. And obviously it's very different when we start talking about marriage, but it's still very much, there's a similarity in the sense of self-giving, self-donating, always concerned about the well-being of the other. What St. Paul says, love is patient, love is kind, love is never jealous. So all this becomes realized in how we respond to that great command, that an understanding of who is man, who is woman, and how that love becomes realized in our communal living, in our relationship to each other, and our obligation toward each other. I'll use an example. I think it's a good one. I often use in our travels and mission work. This is out of a school here in the United States, and it's an all-boys school, and it's in one of the main cities of our country. And I'm being purposely not naming it, so don't ask me. Tell me what that name is. But I'm not going to tell you. But it's in a very difficult city, and in the heart of the city, and it's a Catholic school. And so one day, one of the young men from the school was moving from his home toward the school, and another school, a group of the guys from that school, really surrounded him and got into a fight and really, beat this young man up. They grouped up on him, and so the next day, or that same afternoon, the entire body of that school showed up at the other school.
Oh my gosh.
Now, this is also with the blessing of the school administration.
Of the Catholic school.
Let's handle this out. So basically what my point is not to promote violence or to promote, it's not a revengeful act. But what it showed, though, is that whatever happened to this young man happened to the school. And that's how the student body received it. Now, all these young men come from very, very hard family lives.
Yeah.
And so they realize that we have to help each other. We have to support each other. We have to defend each other. And that's how they saw this, that this assault was not an assault on that student singularly. It was an assault on the entire population of that school. And I think it shows a value.
And that's what St. Paul enjoins upon us, right?
Yes. And so obviously it's how we see that. So for example, when we talk about the unborn, why would I be concerned about an unborn child that's in Africa? Asia, Latin America, down in Argentina, let's say. Why? Because they are part of my human family. And so, of course, I'm concerned about the well-being of that child, no different than the child next to me or in my own family. So to see that value, to see it, and then to want to realize it, bring it into bear, to bring it into life, to give it a purpose and day, this is what the Christian call is. So to build up that beautiful civilization, really, to do that. It takes an effort. So that's a true story. Now, that's from a few years back. So maybe someone listening to us might go back and let me look that up. Let me see where it is. They might find it actually out there. I've talked about it quite a few times, and I've actually made a reference in writing to the actual school. So I'm giving clues.
Well, you can comb through Human Life International's website to find that one, folks.
That's correct. That's right. Or any of my other videos that I've done. I've mentioned the story before.
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of a funny one, but also startling. Anyway, but it illustrates your point well, I think, Father, of the kind of the corporate, not in the sense of collective, right? Because that would be a sort of communist heretical sort of deviation from like taking the ideal of the collective as higher than that of the individual. What we're really saying as Catholics, what the Church is teaching is the kind of the singular importance of the individual, but not to the detriment of the society, but rather to the building up of the society, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And that comes with, I think what I was trying to get at was, with as far as the concept of love, the difference between really what we mean in the church is charity, right? That is the kind of love that Christ is, as opposed to, I mentioned the signs that are around everywhere, or slogans, love is love, or things like that. Well, I mean, that's a true slogan. It depends on what you mean, though, by that word love, because it's a tautology. Love
it's
is
also,
love.
I mean, just like we're talking about two different visions, Tad, we're talking about a very important term. How do we define love?
Right.
So that's why what we're doing right now is very important, and that is, let's make sure we're speaking of the same terminology, because if we're not, then we're already on the wrong foot. But by starting with a clear understanding of the human person, clear understanding of what we mean by love according to the gospel, the caritas, the charity of which Christ calls us to, and also the very reflection of Christ himself. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. What I say to you is love one another. What does that really mean? How do we actualize that love?
Right. Because it doesn't mean I necessarily, have a deep fondness or affection for you, Father, which I do.
Right, sure.
But it's an act of the it's in my intention, for my free will as a person to will. As St. Thomas would say, that will your good, right?
Exactly.
For its own sake, rather than for my pleasure or what I can get out of you.
Exactly. Which is very important. That's why I use that word flourishment. Because the well-being, flourishment, but to seek, and not just to verbalize, I seek your good, Tad, but to really do what I can to bring that to bear. So in a sense, in our audience, who's been who follows the pro-life movement and maybe or maybe not aware of it, I direct them to a video. It's called "Sing a Little Louder." I've used this video throughout my work in the mission field, and it goes back to World War II. And again, it helps to give a real clear understanding. So it's based on a true story. So it's a young boy, now an old man, looking back in time and realizing when he was a young boy during the Second World War, and in the church that he attended, there was a set of railroad tracks that ran right behind the church. And so this track was used to haul people that were going to the concentration camps. So for those in our audience, I really would recommend it. It's a very moving story and about maybe less than 20 minutes long. It is worth the time to not only watch it, but to really grab hold of it. And what the young man, now an older man, is reflecting is what more could he have done? And he's looking back. And the reason why it's called Sing a Little Louder, just to kind of give the story away, is that when the train stopped one day behind the church and screeched, as trains do, that's the sound they make, the church, the pastor was preaching, and so all of a sudden you can hear the cries of the people coming from the train, coming from within the carts that housed all humanity that were being led, to these camps. And so what happened was, in a sense, to drown them out, the pastor, and again, here we're not making, fun of anyone, his response was, in this moment, to pick up a hymnal and to sing above the noise, the cries. And so this young man now, older man, is reflecting, looking back. How did this happen? How did we ignore, the plight of a people suffering? How did we turn and he says, we call ourselves Christian. So we can apply this same reality, to the unborn child, to our elderly that are being euthanized or abandoned, to abandoned children, to trafficking. We can talk about so many things within this conversation about my brother, my sister. And that goes back to the school I referenced. Whatever happens to my brother in that situation happens to me. So if we can really become where that's a part of our thought, and that's where those two visions come in. Instead of seeing, like you articulated beautifully, Tad, what can I get from you? How can I use you and exhaust you as if I were using a water bottle, consumed all the water, and just then throw it away? It's given me everything it can. That is not a vision of humanity that Christ proclaims, and it's not a vision of humanity that promotes the common good. It's a usury. It's a commodification of people, of things, versus the vision of the good, the what is true, what is just, what is beautiful, and seeking that for every individual. And whether, no matter what my profession in life may be, whether it be in medicine, it can be in law, it can be in teaching, education, whatever it means, is to see that. So, and after this, and also in our mission field, talking about marriage. So if every day, and I'm going to use two names, Frank and Cindy. Let's say Frank, married to Cindy, every day, the first thought when Frank wakes up in the morning is, what can I do for the good of my wife today? You know, and then Cindy wakes up and has the same thought. What can I do for the good of my husband today, our family today? And if that is something I wake up with every day, what can I do for the good of others today? And really make it not just a thought, but to bring it to bear. It does change the culture around us. And it influences how people process things and how we treat other people, how we treat in business, how we treat in our daily service. There's so many ways this thought, this vision affects us.
Right.
And that's why I said earlier is that we have to be aware that it's always around us. It's in everywhere. It's in every conversation, every decision that we make. It's all there. And so do I react, to a situation, out of frustration, anger? Or do I respond in a way that is respectful and at the same time maybe firm? Maybe I'm dealing with something that's very difficult, but it doesn't mean I should belittle that individual or ignore their human dignity. There are lots of things that every day that we encounter, and it really it's a decision in that moment. What vision, what path will I take?
Absolutely, Father. And I think it's very clear that this difference is based on the difference between the view of civilization and society is based on a difference between two types of anthropology. And one in which I suppose you could call it secular, you call it atheistic, whatever, agnostic. A person is kind of left undefined. It's just whatever you and I are, and maybe unborn children are that or not or whatever. But anyway, we essentially care about what good can come to us and quality of life, or sort of everything is based on kind of this idea of pleasure. Whereas Christians talk about something very, very specific, very unique. We are made in the image and likeness of God, right? And so that's the Imago Dei. That's critical. That is what makes the difference here. But I wanted to talk about that a little bit, Father, because I think that the difference, that this is a phrase that kind of, we use it so much and it means so much that it gets glossed over and it kind of just goes over our heads like, okay, this is the buzzword. Yeah, we're made in the image and likeness of God. And same with sanctity of life and dignity of life. These we constantly use in the pro-life movement in, Christian teaching and Catholic teaching. And it makes all the difference, but we have to kind of I think it's worth it to dwell on them, on these phrases a little bit and see really what they mean kind of from a theological level, mystical level, because it makes all the difference.
Yeah. I was looking for, as I was, looking through some of the pages, in the article, I quote John Paul in Evangelium Vitae. So in a way, which you're making also a reference to, is that when we lose sight of God, we lose sight of each other. And so which helps us get back to the question of the Imago Dei. It helps us to understand what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God, and to have a true understanding of the transcendent nature that of which man and woman are called, this gift of this desire for eternal life. We're made for God. Paul puts it in his letter to the Ephesians that God made us to love Him. He made us to know, to really made for that life with God. And so starting with that understanding changes the vision of life, and it helps us to focus the meaningfulness of life. Whether we're talking about parenthood, whether we're talking about getting married, whether the vocation be called to the religious life or to the priestly state, or to live beautifully in the single state that God has called this individual, to see that there is a purpose, there is a direction, there is a focus, there is something within me that is bearing witness to something greater than myself, and in whose image I have been made, to know God, to love God, to be with God, and to use my ability of reason to exercise, the freedom to choose this motion toward Him, and to then show that, as our Lord reminds us so beautifully, that whatever we do unto the least of each other, we do unto Him. In a sense, to see how am I reflecting this great image in which I have been made. And as I've said many times, which is not tarnished in a sense of like when we look at our world today that looks at things from a very usury, futile, kind of an illusion that, if I have a disability, I'm kind of less than something. It's a horrible vision of the human person. Or if I'm having difficulty, maybe an incompetent person who's lost cognitive ability, somehow their dignity is somehow diminished. One never loses this dignity. It's an inherent dignity. That's why we use the terminology. It's an unchangeable, an immutable dignity. And it's not something that, that the government bestows or that my parents bestow on me somehow. This is part of who I am and my nature as a human being. And that this call that I'm called to express in word, in action, is something so beautiful. That's why I went back and I wish I could find the actual paragraph in the article, but the idea of that, quoting John Paul, so that when you see this misunderstanding that you mentioned earlier, if in an atheistic mindset, in an agnostic mindset, or in a modern mindset where God does not exist, God is
or is at least forgettable and not relevant.
Exactly. Right. It means that I can then look at you in a very different vision as well. Now, that doesn't mean I can't have in a sense of wanting someone's good, but it doesn't reach the fullness of what it could in Christ and in understanding who man, who woman is, in a true anthropology, as you mentioned. And I think that's a very important distinction and to help us because, for example, you can have a person who does humanitarian things, good things, but is not connected to in a service of God, a service of what God is asking of us. And so there's a good being done, but it's not the fullness of what that good could be if done with the full intention of what Christ calls us to do. So in other words, there's an end. I give this money for this particular good, but I get a plaque. I get my name on a building. I get a scholarship named after me. All things in and of themselves,
or a tax exemption,
right? Nothing bad, but that is not the reason why I would give a cup of water to someone who's thirsty. So we'll go back to the corporal works of mercy.
Right.
We can look at how those are very different, and they're different actions. And as you said very beautifully earlier, Tad, there are different intentions in this as well. And so all this is part of this conversation as we talk about two different visions. And so as we keep this conversation, in our daily life, it also makes people pause. When people step in and do something that people would consider heroic, which in a way may be a heroic act. But when you think of, the value of people laying down their lives for others, people willingly sacrificing some good that they would want for the good of another human being, giving something from their own want when they themselves are sacrificing something great that they have a need for, but they do something for someone else. And we look at this and, we hear story after story, someone trying to save another person who's drowning, and they might save the individual, but they themselves lose their life. So, the idea here is that these actions are around us, and we need to realize that what it calls me and calls each of us to live, and to live in a manner that, I think back, in a way to healthcare. This is another good way of looking at it. We step back in time and realize that the system that we understand today really goes back to religious life. And it goes back to our monasteries and to the church continuing the mission of Jesus, which is healing. All right? So we think about that, and we step back not too long ago when so many of our institutions, especially here in the United States and other countries, were run by Catholic religious. And so, but think about that. So in the morning, when those religious sisters or brothers, in any case, they've started their day with morning prayer, maybe offering of Holy Mass, and spent time in adoration, and then ate their breakfast, if you will, and out the door into the hospital. They brought everything with them. So that it was a continuation. It was a single movement.
Yeah.
And so today, what we see is a disconnect in so many ways from this beautiful life that we're called to live.
Compartmentalization, right?
Yes. And that's why the challenge. So obviously, go back to the story with the young men. Not advocating go out and put your boxing gloves on, but it speaks of something. And so
a fraternity.
Yes, it speaks of a connection. That that there's something that's wrong that happened. There was an injustice that happened today, and we have to respond to it. And I think this is so important for us in our conversation: is how do we instill that within every soul to really consider the injustice. I jokingly would say, if you give 3 children and you give one child a 10-pound chocolate bar, the second child a 5-pound chocolate bar, and the third child a 10-ounce chocolate bar, I guarantee that child with a 10-ounce bar is going to say, "Wait a minute. Something's not right here. What happened? Why did this one get?" So we sense this. We know this. Something within us kind of recognizes there's an injustice here. And we tend to bury it. We, especially in our individualistic culture, our kind of self-determination culture that we have, we kind of forget. But tragedies happen, and it kind of pulls people out of it. I know from South Louisiana, hurricanes, devastating. The tornadoes that affect our country, the snowstorms, and all the dynamics, fires, and all of a sudden people are cooking for their neighbors that they haven't spoken to in 10 years. They're giving clothes. They're going out and do charitable things. Something within us calls us to recognize there's a need. Yeah. There's something in that person that needs my help. But the tragedy goes away and we kind of fall back. Yeah. My challenge in the article is that it should never fall back. We should constantly be moving toward this end. And it really starts when I know who I am and I know who you are, and this great vision of a civilization of life and love. And it's a wonderful place. And if I may say, it's never going to be perfect. So it's
as you mentioned in the article, right?
It's not going to be perfect because I'm a far from perfect being. And sometimes my decisions do not reflect the very call of which I'm called to live. Now, that doesn't excuse me either, all right? I got to work against it. I got to discipline myself. But to know that we're working toward that, as St. Paul would, our Lord reminds us so beautifully, to be holy, to be perfect, to strive for it. So every day we just got to keep trying, got to keep doing it. And that's what gets us going. That's what, when you think about so many parents every day caring for a child of disability, every day they get up and every morning they do everything they can for the good of that other person. So this is something we just got to keep doing. Yeah. So I think it's a great challenge today, for us to talk about this, but to bring it to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, yeah. And it really is a mystery then, just as far as the image and likeness of God, the dignity and sanctity of life. It is a mystery as to because we obviously, Scripture says no one has ever seen God, right? It's in the Gospel of John. But we do know, inasmuch as Christ has revealed Him to us, that ideal to which we are to attain and kind of strive to imitate, and therefore that goes into all the service that you were speaking of, and just the willing of the good of the other, the love, charity, divine charity.
Exactly, and the same thing, think of this, so that the invisible becomes visible, and so we talk about this, St. Paul in his own way says, God, the beauty, that the God, becomes one of us, so the invisible God becomes visible. He walks among us, speaks to us, and becomes one of us. And I think it's such a powerful thing. And it's something I learned from an older priest that I think is something that helps me, and I tend to be, have a tender heart, in the sense of concern for others. Goes back to my own childhood. I think it's just very much nurtured in me. And so, but an older priest taught me this as well, to help manifest it. Think of the people that we meet every day on the street, in our various communities. So we name them transients or the homeless or so forth, and people kind of try to give them a grouping, if you will. But these are human beings, brothers and sisters. This is, someone's father, someone's mother, a brother, an uncle, a cousin, someone's child, a grandchild. So when we start looking at this, the whole argument we have against pornography is not just on the issue of the abuse and misuse of human sexuality, but also the real fundamental is the misuse and abuse of a human person, the commodification of another individual for the sexual pleasure of another human being. This is again, but when we're mindful of this, so when I'm driving or I'm walking in a given city, I cannot resolve these problems by myself, but one thing I do is I extend a blessing, even though they don't see me. I can be driving my car, and I give a blessing. This is, again, someone. This is not a thing. This is a person, a human being with dignity, just like mine. To be mindful of that. And you know, we hear this in the scripture of, you know, kind of crossing to the other side of the street, all right, you know, of the priest and so forth. But you know, how many people do this every day too? And look, I don't question. There many people sadly struggle with, you know, mental difficulties. Some people can be very hard to deal with on the street and situations, and we don't advise, you know, putting people in difficult situations, you know. But the idea here is to really pause and think of the plight of that individual. What's brought that individual? You know, no matter what the circumstance may be that this person has chosen and embraced, that has led them down this path, whatever it is, but to remember that this is a person, and that there's concern that I should have in some way toward that individual. And we need to, in a sense, unclog the deaf ears.
Right.
You know,
right.
remove the hardness of our hearts and the cynicism that we have.
Even a kind gesture, a kind word. You know, as our Lord says, whatever you do to these little ones, you do to me,
Exactly.
to these least.
Exactly. So, but it's a mindset. So that's what we started with. And I think it's just, that's why I go back to the very beginning and just reiterate that it's every day. Every day we encounter these two visions. Every decision we make deals with these two visions in some way or another.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's why it's so important to talk about. And if we can move upstream, if we can get, for example, if we can get before, why do we have abortion? Why do we have euthanasia? Why are we seeing human trafficking? Why do we see the promotion of pornography? And all the various things, the bioethical dilemmas, the moral dilemmas we see in our culture. We need to get further upstream and really understand how all this begins. Yeah. So if my understanding of Tad is someone I can use for my own means and my own ends to achieve my own goals and my own outcomes, no matter what how that diminishes your dignity or in a sense diminishes your life, is a selfish motivation. And it's a vision that we see running through our cultures in the West.
Exactly.
Another vision is the other vision, and that is an anthropology that begins with who Tad is, the dignity of the man before me. Whether he sees it or not does not change it. It is there, and it's up to me to see it and to respect it and to honor it and to help some kind of way. If Tad has lost his direction or Tad has no longer believes in it, how can I help him understand it and to see it in himself again? And then that's how we start building and cultivating that culture and sustaining a culture of life. So this is why this is so important to have. So I think it's just a good thing, and I'm so grateful that you decided to choose this as our kind of our discussion topic today.
Well, thank you, Father. I've been it's been great to pick your brain about this as well. I did just want to ask you, Father, kind of segue into this. You know, we're talking about the culture of life and the culture of death. How has it happened that the culture of death has overtaken to such an extent? I mean, we discussed how the culture of life, culture of death, city of man, city of God have never been and never will. At least the culture of life has never been perfect. The civilization of love has never been perfect and never will be perfected here on earth. In heaven it will be. But somehow it seems that in the last century or so, or two, the culture of death, the opposite, has really overtaken. And I was wondering, Father, if I could sort of question you about where you think that's coming from. What is unique about our situation now that the offenses, abuses of human persons seem to be so much greater?
Well, if I can just put it this way, I mean, obviously our time doesn't allow us to go through historical, how this is over, as you said, this is not something that's occurred overnight. It hasn't happened over the last decade. It's been many decades, sometimes even a century of thought and processes that have led us down this path. But when you think about, how do we, ultimate your question, Tad, is how have we become desensitized? How have we become, in a sense, to the point where we don't realize, what our choices we have made. So you look at the Second World War, and we look at some of the issues of the concentration camps. We look at the issues of how did the Nazi Party be able to advance what it was doing with regard to, not only our Jewish brothers and sisters, but Catholics and Christians and
priests.
Other, exactly. But you can even step back even further in time and get example upon example of atrocities done against humanity. And typically, I would say, if I may kind of bring them in under one umbrella, it's when we really become desensitized and we begin to determine who has value, who doesn't have value. And it's all basically arbitrary, because today someone can say that you have value and tomorrow say you don't have value. Well, what determines that? And typically it's about those who have seats of power, and we know that how that affects decision making. And so in the idea of I want something, and the only way that I'm going to be able to obtain that is by basically diminishing your influence. Mm-hmm. So how can this is all what helps emerge this conversation. And so we see it today. So in the conversation of dealing with the disabled, for example, let's look at Great Britain. Let's look at we talked about this before in other podcasts, when you think of what's happening in many parts of the Netherlands, and you think of how we deal with children with Down syndrome. You mentioned mm-hmm. this earlier. Well, it's not so much that we've resolved, from a genetic, medical situation of how to address, this issue. No, what many countries have done is basically promote systems that annihilate people diagnosed with Down syndromes.
Right.
Down syndrome. So what we've done is we've designated a certain group of people, and we say, and we try to justify ourselves by talking about compassion. We don't want them to suffer. We don't want them to have difficult lives. But really, in reality, what John Paul would say is that we don't want to be bothered. We don't want to be inconvenienced. So right. we convince ourselves, and we then desensitize ourselves. Well, if I can do that, Mother Teresa said this, if a mother can kill her own child, then basically, if I may take that thought, then why can't I kill you? Why can't I kill someone else? What is the difference mm-hmm. here? Yeah. So this is the mindset, what happens when we fall into that desensitization, that we become completely oblivious to the world around us and the reality of the human people that share my journey and share my life and share my existence.
The darkness of the intellect that comes with sin.
It does. And so we can say it's a spiritual component. Obviously, we know we're in a spiritual battle.
Yeah.
But also, we can look at secular values. We can look at how those values are promoted. We can look at the whole issue of modernism and how that's influenced. The whole sexual revolution, how that's influenced. Mm-hmm. Government policies, all these various things and daily living affect us and how we respond. So today in our culture, in the Western culture especially, where abortion has been legalized, most people have become desensitized, thinking mm-hmm. it's normative, it's law, it is what it is. So they no longer think about it. It's just what it is. Yeah. And so now we speak of rights and we speak about, and so forth. But what we don't realize is at the end of the day, someone dies. A human being dies. And so this is the part. Same thing with pornography. How many people are addicted or participating in this and are completely desensitized, whether that person is there of free will or coerced? The reality is another person is being used.
Yeah.
For what end? So human trafficking. Let's talk about labor trafficking as well with the human trafficking. Literally, I know of a situation where an entire group of men, young men, were kidnapped and then brought into slavery, basically. Human trafficking into modern-day slavery. And for 20 years, these families of these young men then thought they were gone, they were dead, they never knew where they were. 20 years later, it was unmasked, and these 20 young men returned. Well, in some regard, the families had their mother and fathers were gone, they were dead. Their brothers and sisters were no more. There was even a situation of recent where a group of young men, your age, Tad, mm-hmm. kidnapped, brought into 15, 20 years of forced labor, freed. Now, let's say you were married. Mm-hmm. You come back and your wife is remarried. What was she to do?
Yeah.
No record of you. This is what we talk about when we talk about people. We're talking about impact. Mm-hmm. So that's why this conversation, mm-hmm. again, it's important to keep bringing up, and I'm being repetitive purposely, so that maybe if someone comes in the beginning of our program and comes at the end, they can hear. But the idea that recognizing, trying to tune those ears in, to become sensitive. And there's a phrase in a Christmas carol. I think it's by the Christmas of the Ghost of Christmas Present, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. Remember when Ebenezer, talks about the idea about, if they can't afford to be cared for, then let them die. Mm-hmm. All right? And remember what happens in the story as it unfolds. Ebenezer comes to know the child of little Tim, and realizing, please don't let him die. Please, if there's nothing that can be done, he repeats the words of Ebenezer. Mm-hmm. And Ebenezer says, you use my own words against me. Then he says to him, maybe next time you'll think, I'm paraphrasing now, before you open your mouth, about who these people are. Mm-hmm. I think that's the key here, is to realize that who our people are, and who. So whether they live across the planet from me or right underneath my own roof, mm-hmm. my response should still be the same. Yeah. And that's where we have to keep going with this, Tad.
Yeah, absolutely, Father. And I think we only have time for a couple more questions here, but I wanted to ask, as far as the culture of death goes, would it be fair to describe as sort of like, in scare quotes again, the crowning jewels, quote unquote, of the culture of death as abortion and euthanasia, and then maybe contraception is the linchpin, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the contraceptive mentality that kind of says, my pleasure is more important than even natural consequences, but also any kind of, effects on other people. Is that a fair characterization, you think,
Sure.
Father?
I mean, it's a falsification of goods, ultimately. Mm-hmm. The good of marriage, the good of the conjugal act, the fruit that flows from the good of marriage and the good of conjugal love, but also the falsification of life. Mm-hmm. That abortion denies. It denies a good. It denies the gift of life. Mm-hmm. Euthanasia then looks at a human being and says that whatever reason, whether they be terminally ill or whatever the dynamic may be, that their value, and you hear this, from people, mm-hmm. I don't want to be a burden on people. Well, what does that mean? Yeah. So it's important, to realize, what's underlying these issues, and to keep addressing them from the point of view that this falsification only produces further. One of our staff members loves to say, "Oh, it can't get any worse," and I've challenged them and said, "Don't say that anymore," because it does. Because we, as you mentioned earlier, how did we get here? Well, because we don't learn. We look over what we've done in our history, and we think we've gotten better. And in many ways, we have grown, but in so many ways, we have not. And so today the fruit that continues to manifest itself through the violence against marriage, through contraception, has led now to the violence against human life. Because if life was not wanted in the very beginning of a conjugal act, all right, so why would it be wanted if it comes into being? So mm-hmm. now we see the need for abortion. So obviously abortion, the mindset of contraception with abortion, then leads to another mindset, that mindset that we see now in euthanasia. So when life is degraded into the point and it's devalued and it's given definitions through futility, and basically again that commodification, usury, then basically you come to a stage in your life where it doesn't mean old age. It could be that you become debilitated. You become, in a sense, a need upon society. Well, mm-hmm. society says, well, we don't need to be burdened by you. Well, all that goes back to that mindset that began with contraception. This self-determination and this unwillingness to offer oneself, to be open, to be one that's concerned about, self-giving. See, we've changed the terms and we've changed the definitions. And so this is what's brought us here. So we have to peel all of that back and get back to really what is the beauty, who is man, who is woman, what is the gift of life, what is the purpose of life, what is this understanding of Imago Dei. All of that continuing. And that's why you see so many of us in this movement bringing up these terms constantly. And you're right, Tad, we do need to take time every once in a while and just redefine them in a sense of, not in a sense of redefine what I want them to believe, but to help people to see them again, hear them again, and to recommit to them again. And so, yeah, I think it's that falsification is so important, for people to see, because that's what happened. We're falsifying goods.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Father. I think that's as clear an explanation as it can get. So I just want to ask at the last juncture here, what do we do about it? What do Catholics, what is the action plan here? Catholics, pro-lifers, you've talked about how we kind of, I guess you could say, get that, heighten our consciousness, if you want to use that sort of terminology, but at least become aware, be sensitized to these things. But if the fundamental issue is the loss of the sense of God, as St. John Paul II puts it in Evangelium Vitae, what is the action there?
Sure.
The spiritual impulse. How do we have a renewal in prayer and kind of in our own interior lives, such that we then can look outward and say, my brothers and sisters, made in the image and likeness of God.
Well, in a way, you've just answered it.
Okay.
I mean, there lies the answer. So I think, from those of us who are already aware, so how can we further tune our ears? And you just gave a beautiful answer. I need to keep drawing closer to Christ. Draw nearer. The nearer I draw toward Him, there is no room for darkness. In other words, I become much more alert, much more aware, and I become aware of my own need, my own hunger, my own want, and then I become to recognize the want and the need of my brother and my sister. So definitely, my call as a leader within this pro-life movement is to keep drawing nearer to Christ Himself, in whose name and witness that I continue to give witness. So it's manifesting that in my daily living, which means it's a constant. It doesn't just happen. I got to keep working and cooperating with grace and growing in that grace. And so the same thing now for the world. Now, how does that change? Great example, Tad, you gave. And that is, how can I be a light? Christ says, you are the light of the world, all right? So how do I express that light? Well, it's my daily living. And I think it's, how do I step into my work environment, my recreation, my friendships? In other words, in my day, how do I manifest God in my life? So that, as Paul would say, no longer do I live, but Christ lives in me. How is that done? Simple. Can I walk away, and if I gave you a survey after I walked away, would you say this was a kind, meek, charitable, gentle, loving, joyful? What would manifest the terminology that this person is really manifesting a virtuous, a meritorious life? And then how does that transmit in the daily decisions? So one person at a time makes the powerful impact. And so if I may use again, as I've done many times, the March for Life in Washington, D.C., founded and created by Nellie Gray. One person stepped forward and became a light. And now many other people have joined in that. And so the movement of our founder, Father Paul Marx, one man stepped forward, became a light. And that light drew other people to join in. So that's how this movement moves forward. And so Christ did it, right? Come and follow. You want to live? Come and follow. Come and see. All right? So it is one person at a time. And it's one individual moment, one situation at a time. And then when people walk away from that moment and they remember, that this person manifested something uniquely different, right? Because in our culture, it's, what do you want from me? All right? So I want nothing. Why are you doing it? I want nothing. That's completely against the grain. So this is a way to continue to push against that desensitization. It's a way of pushing against this in this individual who just wants to be self-determined. It's a push against this individualistic mentality. John Paul would say that all these isms that he would list out in names. This is the way you push back. And this is that's how we change the culture. This is how we push against that tsunami that we stand against. And it is a tsunami, all right? And you know, in our movement, we know that we're against the majority of the mindset of our world, especially the elite, the governments of the Western world, you know, the mindset that we see in the United Nations and other organizations. But it doesn't change the truth. It doesn't change our determination. Stay the course, persevere, which goes back, prayer life, spiritual growth. You know, these are all the things that happen. So for myself, to all those who are listening and, you know, to our podcast today, is to encourage, just to really encourage the depth of a prayer life, a spiritual life that is growing, maturing, and deepening. And I will tell you this, if that prayer life is truly growing, sincerely growing, you can't sit on your sofa for long because Christ is calling. Get off the sofa. No, what did the angels say to them at the day of the ascension? What are you doing looking up in the heavens? Go. There's work to be done. So that's what I would say to all of our audience and to myself every day. There's work to be done.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I will close with this, and that is, I'm working to put HLI out of business. And I mean that sincerely, is that the goal is that this work that is directly to address these bioethical issues that we are dealing with in this culture, if we can resolve this, then HLI has a different work to do, and it won't be this work.
Yeah.
All right? So this is what we're after, you know? So that's what this is about. So, prayer life.
Well, absolutely. Thank you very much, Father. That's wonderful. I think there's no better way to put it than that. So thank you very much. And thank you very much for watching the Culture of Life podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you again next week. God bless.